Alrighty guys, welcome to the channel. My name is Drew Cypert, sole proprietor of Bandito Amp Repair right here in Lubbock, Texas, where we repair and modify guitar amplifiers. Today I have a 1969 Silverface Fender Super Reverb on the bench, coming in for a recap, all original, which is what we love. And we're also going to be doing a little modification to this thing. We're going to be giving it the old Blackfacing, as they call it in the industry. So first, let's go ahead and do this recap, get this thing running healthy, and then we're going to get into the modification, my thoughts on it, and precisely what we're going to be doing as far as the Blackfacing is concerned. Let's get started. Alrighty guys, got the doghouse off, and don't you love seeing those original filter caps there? It always makes me excited to be the first one to get to do the recap on this. We do have a little bit of what appears to be a little bit of leakage from this one. That's kind of that white stuff on the eyelet board there. So these are definitely, they're toast. They need to be replaced. We're going to be going back in with FNTs. Okay, so now that we have these caps popped up, we can see that one of these dropping resistors, it's the 1K, has gotten very crispy. So we're going to go ahead and replace both of these dropping resistors here, this 1K and the 4.7K. Alrighty guys, two new dropping resistors, all new F&T caps put in here right. You want to make sure you get the polarity correct on that reservoir cap right there. And we're ready to flip this thing over and get started recapping the interior chassis. Alright guys, we're now looking on the inside. So the caps we're going to be changing here, of course, is this negative DC bias capacitor. We'll be going back in with an F&T 100 at 100. And we're going to go ahead and change out all of these cathode bypass capacitors here, these little white guys. There's one hiding right up there. And we're going to be going back in with Sprague capacitors there, 25 at 25, and I believe we have one right here which is 5 at 25, and the one we have to replace it is a 5 at 50, which is right there. I'm going to make sure not to get that one mixed up somewhere else, otherwise this thing might be sounding a little funny. So let's go ahead and get started. And you know, this isn't super critical, but I think it's good practice to always, if you can, try to get the value of the capacitor facing up so where you could read it. You know, that makes it easier on either you in the future or another tech in the future. Like I said, it's not super critical, but I like to do that. I think it's maybe a little anal retentive, but, you know. Obviously, next we're moving on to these cathode bypass capacitors. I'm going to go ahead and start with this kind of oddball 5UF. Reroute some wires here, make sure you don't burn anything up. One thing extra to pay attention to whenever you're, especially when you're taking out these cathode bypass capacitors, pay attention to the cathode resistor. If you see that thing start to sweat, that's not a good sign. That probably means that you need some new cathode resistors there. So just pay close attention to that sort of thing, and you'll know when it sweats. It's got a, I mean, it literally sweats. So something to think about. One more quick tip here. Whenever you have your ground junction here and you have a really tight eyelet, it's really good to take like an awl and just kind of work you a space in there. That way you can take your next bypass cap and it'll just kind of slip on in there. Just like that. Much easier than fighting it. Alrighty guys, on to our last little bypass capacitor up here. All right, last one, guys. We're done. All right, just to show you guys these grid and screen resistors. A lot of times you'll see a lot of heat stress on those and it's good to replace them. These actually look like they're in very, very good shape. So we are going to leave the grid and screen resistors on the 6L6s. Moving on to the next step of typical repair, we're gonna go ahead and replace this cable here with a 3-prong cable, and we're gonna go ahead and remove the death cap back here. We're gonna dead end this polarity switch, obviously, and rewire the primary wiring to modern standards. I'm gonna use our big boy pliers here. Work out that retainer there. We wanna save that because we're gonna reuse it. And I think I'm just going to go ahead and snip this out. Alright. And obviously, make sure it's not plugged into the wall. Don't be dumb. Ooh. That power switch is loose. That's sketchy. We're gonna take a little bit of a dinner break. We got a little bit of risotto and Dr. Pepper Zero because we're bougie. You know, when it comes to sodas made in Texas, Dr. Pepper is obviously king or whatever, but Big Red, which is also made in Texas, is better than Dr. Pepper. You can come at me. I'm ready to throw hands for that cold fact. Alrighty guys, so the basic servicing has been done. We've recapped all of the electrolytics. We got a new 3-prong power cable put in. The death cap has been isolated here. And the primary wiring has been redone to modern standards. So let's go ahead and move over to that Blackfacing mod. And we'll take a look at the schematic and show you essentially what we're going to be doing. Alright, so we got the schematic pulled up for this amplifier. It is an AA1069 Silverface Super Reverb. Alright, so whenever we're talking about the Silverface era of Fender amplifiers and what separates them from their older brother, the Blackface Fender amplifiers, we're typically going to talk about two things. Number one is going to be the bias circuit for the output tubes. So on pre-CBS Fender amplifiers, let me switch over here. We had, this is an AA763, so this is a Blackface Super Reverb. We had a bias control right here that affected both tubes at the same time, right? It's just regular old bias control. Now by the 1970s, and by the time CBS took over, you don't see that same type of bias circuit anymore. Now what you see is a bias balance circuit. Now, this gets a lot of talk, and I will say there is a reason why they did this, right? So nowadays when we think about buying output tubes, we're typically buying JJ, Apex matched 6L6s or 6V6s or whatever tubes you're getting. See, back in the 1970s, you didn't buy matched tubes. You just went to Radio Shack and you picked up two 6L6s. They might be well matched, they might be poorly matched. So the idea of the bias balance is it would balance the difference in bias setting for the two 6L6s that you bought at the Radio Shack. So this is actually, I mean, it's a useful circuit. It makes sense for the time period. Now, as far as changing the bias in order to quote-unquote blackface the amplifier, sometimes I think it's appropriate. Other times, I don't think it's appropriate. In the case of this amplifier here, we have two old stock GE power tubes right here. Now the likelihood that those two tubes are matched, I mean, Maybe, but there's a pretty good chance they're probably not matched. In which case, it's probably smarter to keep this bias balance circuit in place, because otherwise, in order to change this, which affects sound like not at all, in order to change this over to the more old school blackface type circuit over here, I'm going to have to get two new 6L6s that match if these two GEs don't, right? That's half a bill right there, just for the sake of saying that your bias circuit has been blackfaced. So, like I said, if it needs new output tubes, maybe, you know, that's something to consider. But and it's certainly a much more useful circuit over here on this blackface type bias circuit, because now we buy matched tubes. We don't need a bias balance. But in the case of this amplifier, the likelihood of these two 6L6s actually being balanced is pretty low. So we'll more than likely not mess with the bias. Now, as to the second thing that characterizes silverface amplifiers in comparison to blackface amplifiers, usually has to do with negative feedback loops. Now, on a typical silverface Fender amplifier, no matter what model, you're going to see local negative feedback loops all over the place, especially on something like an AB165, which was the Silverface Bassman. I mean, it had negative feedback loops everywhere. I mean, and so the trick with changing out with quote unquote blackfacing this is literally just removing all those local negative feedback loops. And now locating them can be a little tricky. I can tell you right now, these two 2000 picofarad capacitors right here, these are definitely related to negative feedback. So in order to get this more like the blackface right here, obviously those two are gone. So we're just going to remove those two capacitors. And what you'll find is whenever you're quote-unquote blackfacing an amplifier, you're usually just taking crap out. So other than taking out these two 2000 picofarad capacitors, doing some negative feedback cancellation on the 6L6s right here, we're also going to be making some changes right over here to the phase inverter. So let me switch over to the AB763. This is a blackface super reverb. Right here on our plate resistors, we see 82K on the top and we see 100K on the bottom plate. That's very typical of a Fender amplifier. Now over here on the AA1069, which is our amplifier, the Silverface, we see 47K and a 47K right here. Now what this is probably doing is it's increasing the voltage on our 12AT7 here, which is raising the clean headroom of this particular tube and probably trying to prevent early breakup from our phase inverter. Now, also that could be driving the 6L6s a little harder, but then we got negative feedback going on here. Just trust me whenever I say this, with Silverface amps, the name of the game in the 1970s with the Silverface was stiff, clean, and loud. Now, that doesn't mean that that's bad, right? I think Silverface amps get a bad rep for that sort of a thing, but honestly, that's what people wanted. And some people still want that. You know, if you're a kind of player that really likes really clean sound all the way up the volume spectrum, then a Silverface is probably a better amplifier for you than, say, a Blackface like this one. So the customer requested this procedure to blackface this Silverface amplifier because he does want a little bit more early breakup. So in order to get that to him, we're going to change these two resistors, the 47Ks, for an 82K and a 100K. And we're just going to remove these two local negative feedback capacitors right here on the two 6L6s. Let's get started. All right, so those two 2000 picofarad capacitors are right here, attached to the tube socket itself, and taking them out is really just that simple, guys. Like I said, a lot of times whenever you're blackfacing a Silverface amplifier, it doesn't take any real effort because you're mostly just taking shit out. Alright, takes care of that. Now the two resistors that we're going to be changing are going to be these two little guys right here. Now we do need to kind of trace the circuit just a little bit to figure out which one needs to be the 100K and which one needs to be the 82K. And it's just going to have to be following some things around to get us some context clues. But I can assure you we will figure it out. And the way we figure that out is by looking at the pinout of a 12AT7, same as the 12AX7. All these dual triodes are the same. And we're going to try to locate the grid that's related to its respective plate. So we know that pin 2 goes to one grid and it's related to pin 1, which goes to one plate. And the same thing goes with this side. Pin 7 is the grid and 6 is the plate of the grid on 7. So 6 and 7 and 1 and 2. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to go back to our schematic. We see that on the grid of one of them we have a 0.1 and on the grid of the other one we have a 0.001. So if we can find the 0.1, we find the grid, we find out what pin that is, find the plate that it corresponds with, and then we know that that's the one that needs to be at 100. Let's do some back tracing. Okay, so we found our 0.1. It's right here, connects to that eyelet, and it goes right up here to pin 7, which means we need to find pin 6. Follow that to right here. That means this one right here needs to be 100K, and this one over here needs to be 82K. And let's just trace that back. That goes to pin 1. We follow 2, which is the grid, and it comes down here to a 0.001, just like the schematic. So 100K, 82K, let's do it. So for all you guys out there who are perhaps a little OCD, I'm going to go ahead and give you a forewarning here. My 82K are going to be carbon film, and my 100K just happen to be metal. So yeah, sorry in advance, but that's what I'm working with right now. There we go. Alrighty guys. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and bring this amp up slowly on the Variac to set in all those new capacitors. Then we will check the bias, adjust the bias if needed, and then we are going to go from there. Maybe do a sound check. That'd be pretty rad. Let's do it. Alright, so we're coming up on the Variac. We're reading about 40 volts now. Let's see if we can read anything on our DC. So let's put our black end on our gator clip here. No sense in having two hands in the chassis. Alright, starting to warm up. I'm seeing like 1 or 2 volts there. Still too low to really get any good measurements. But we are passing voltage to the circuit, which is a good sign. Alright, so at about 60 volts on the primary, on our power transformer. Might help if I was measuring DC. We are now reading 230 volts. It's about right. Everything's looking healthy so far. We're almost to that point where we hit about 70, 68. We're going to start passing signal from our signal generator into our dummy load, monitoring back on our benchtop speaker here. 72 volts. Alright, we're monitoring the output on the scope. If you ever wondered what breakup looks like, it looks like this. Pretty neat. All the way up. Alright, so I went ahead and got started on some of this bias check. I do have a bias probe coming in the mail, but it's not here yet. So we're doing this Uncle Doug style with a pen, paper, voltmeter, and a calculator. So we've got our measurements here. We've got some wildly mismatched tubes right now. I went ahead and checked the resistance on the balance pot. It's like right in the middle. Like, why even have it? Somebody just decided they didn't want to use it. I'm going to take 5.39, it's our voltage drop, divide that by 49.2 equals, we're going to multiply that times 447. There's no f***ing way. Okay, no joke guys. So I did check the bias balance pot. It's sitting right in the middle. These things are wildly imbalanced. I have on one tube 14.73 watts plate dissipation, which is like super cold, and on one, I shit you not, 48.91. That's like, what is that? Like 160%? Insane. These tubes have been running like that for years. These old GE tubes. I'm blown away. So let's make some adjustments, see if we can get this balanced out, and see if we're gonna have to drag the whole bias down because that's a wild number. All right, guys, we ended up having to take out one of these GE 6L6s. I just could not get that one down low enough to get even close to this. There wasn't enough swing in the bias balance control. I ended up going back in with a old stock Sylvania like this one, so that way it's kind of dated similarly, and was able to balance them out. I got 13.8 on that Sylvania and 15.2 on the other GE. Now this is still really low. We're wanting to see this number at least 20 watts for 6L6s to be biased within that sweet range of 60 to 85%. All right, we're going to take our little probe here with our resistor, discharge these capacitors, and then we're going to try to change out this 15 k ohm resistor on that bias balance pot down to a, something. I think I'm going to try 9.1. Let's do something drastic. Let's go wild. All right. All right, let's give that one a shot. Okay, so we went with that 9.1, which wound up being perfect. I toyed around with the balance a little bit more and was able to get them fairly well balanced right here. So we're sitting at 22.9 watts of plate dissipation on that new Sylvania at 67% of max. That's running really good. On the old GE, we're running 22.2 watts plate dissipation, which is 74% of maxed. That's a pretty well balanced set, and I think this amp is going to be ready to go. Let's do a sound check. Got an SM57 right here. Gonna run it into GarageBand because we're bougie. And yeah, I appreciate you guys watching.